Young people getting addicted to their smartphones is rapidly growing.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Scorpion Podcast, episode 29. Today, with me, we have Dr. Vincent Adejumo, and he's the author of The Return of Black Nationalism and the Death of White Supremacy, which delves into the dynamic history and very interesting future of Black nationalism in the United States. So, Dr. Adejumo is intent on taking his readers on somewhat of a journey through time, unraveling all of the intricacies of Black nationalism throughout history and how has it affected the contemporary culture of the United States of America and where he sees it going from here. So, Dr. Adejumo, we're very glad to have you. Welcome. If you could just give us a brief summary of your work and what it is that you wanted to touch upon, how did the inspiration for your actual book come about? Some interesting topics that you found in the research. We'd be very glad to listen.
Sure. So my work mainly concerns the African American identity in the United States, especially in the South. And my work seeks to bring that to the forefront here to audiences here in America to the point that they can understand. Obviously, I come from an academic background formally, but informally, I am a person that is still very much in touch with the grassroots. And so my work is based on ensuring that the grassroots understands our world today, specifically when it comes to the experience of African Americans and defining the problems that we have from a historical perspective, and then coming up with solutions within that context. And so, within that context of solutions-oriented writing, I came across the subject of Black nationalism, which I came across maybe a decade ago. And from that point, just attending various conferences, I have a background in my PhD is political science. And I taught African American studies at the University of Florida from 2013 until 2025 spring semester. And so during that time period, between going to conferences, talking with people, participating in marches and resistance movements throughout the Gainesville and Florida community with different things going on, it kind of shaped my perception of Black nationalism and how we can fit it into today's context for the problems that the African American community has faced since being brought here and continues to face in this important moment and will continue to face in the future if things do not change as far as our systemic way of thinking and going about our issues. So that's what I seek to do in my work. Obviously, I wrote the book, The Return of Black Nationalism, The Death of White Supremacy, because I truly believe that in order for the African American to move beyond its current condition of oppression and to have equity in the society, we truly have to implement a nationalist mindset, trickling down into education and then also into our economics. It has to be a part of the African American culture, Black nationalist way of thinking and doing. And so that's what my work seeks to do in this book specifically, and then other things that I have written throughout the years and continue to write. It may not be directly Black nationalism, but it leads back to a nationalist mindset because, again, I always try to get to the solutions of the matter. My main thing is I just don't want my work to sit in some library at the bottom basement and never see the light of day. Like I want to make sure that the grassroots and the overall community is getting exposed to it and really penetrating the mindset. So
Yeah, for sure. There are a lot of topics touched down upon in your book. Chiefly among them are the listing of a lot of people who have been associated with Black nationalism and civil rights movement in the United States. And as an educator with your aforementioned background, University of Florida, which is actually strikes very close to heart. There are obviously going to be a lot of misconceptions and misinterpretations in how Black history is taught in a lot of colleges and secondary schools in the United States that you're keenly aware of. Chiefly among them, the fact that very often African American history for most people that are taught in public school often begins around the 1960s, and they list Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And then there is a whole history of abolitionism before then, and it diverges into this entire, more modern history with figures like the Shakur family, and then parts of history that are not, put into the common textbook, such as various intricacies surrounding the Panther Party. There's a lot of like very different, alleys that you could go down in this, but one that I will specifically touch down upon when reading the preview of your book. Uh, there is a lot of, talk about this very specific period of history. About this period of history where there was a sort of I would say a difference between how different figures within this entire circle were approaching the issue of the new civil rights registration. So, despite the civil rights legislation being passed in the 1960s, the structural disparities that had actually arisen prior to them even being conceived upon still persisted. There were still a lot of Southern Democrats, for example, in the United States Congress that were openly advocating for segregation and the like. But there was actually a very strong integrationist movement and strategy, from what I understand, within Black nationalism, and there's a lot of argumentation as to whether it inherently undermined the nationalist progress. Were these two competing factions? Was the integrationist struggle insufficient without parallel, Black-led institutional development? There was a lot of, very heavy shifting universities and colleges that were formerly, built specifically to house, African Americans who could not get into the white-led colleges and schools were now redistributed as, historically Black colleges and universities, and now were put up on this status while no major, restructuring efforts were actually conceived upon, and this was viewed as equality. So, in your mind, while doing the research for the book, did you find a very strong, this integrationist versus Black nationalist struggle? Was there a strong difference in an argument between these two factions, one of which believed that the Black community should assimilate with the larger community of America on a political level quicker than ever before, and the second community, which believed that there should be Black-led institutions that should be built from the ground up to rival the institutions which had already existed in the U.S. for the past 200 years. What was your take on that, and what did you find in your research?
Great question. So, um, I came across some people throughout my time before I even wrote the book or thought about the book, but just in my development, who were part of the both the civil rights movements and the Black nationalist movements. Whether you're talking about the first iteration of the Black Panther Party for self-defense or the Nation of Islam during the time of Malcolm X when he was active. And many of those people feel that we, in the pursuit of civil rights, which obviously was a necessity to exist, not only to exist in this society, but the fact of the matter is that the African American pays taxes just like everyone else. So the thought process is that the African Americans should have access to those resources just like everyone else, right? But obviously the factor is racism, and not only just racism in general, but systemic racism. So what happens is that you have the Black nationalist movement that comes about even before Malcolm X, but really solidified with Malcolm X's presence and experience. And I talk about that in the book, the movements before and after him that were Black nationalists in nature. But the issue is that Malcolm X advocated for the African American to build strong institutions, whether we're talking about specifically economic institutions. That has to be the base, right? Because you can't do anything politically, and it's hard to do to be taken serious socially if you don't have a strong economic base. So when these two, and it really was in many respects, two different factions. Now, a lot of times, many people who were active in the civil rights movement, they crossed over into the Black nationalist movement, and then vice versa. So you had those different cross listing of ideas, which both movements sought to do the same thing, which is the liberation of the African American. It was just the routes to go about it, and also the end result of it. So you know, you have people like Bayard Rustin, very strong in the civil rights movement, who truly believed that white African American children going to school with white children would be in the best interest, would be some sort of liberation, right? Versus Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, their teachings believe that we should develop our own schools and continue our own education path for ourselves to solve our the African American specific problems. And so you see this convergence or this collision in the 60s with that. Obviously, the civil rights faction and thought process of that won out. And now you have a situation today where, yes, the African American is free, like we're not, you know, we're not chattel slavery, but at the same time, the African American is still subjected to racism, and the fact that, for example, you see the stats that just came out today that there's a 7.5 unemployment rate in the African American community, ticked up from 6% to 7.5 within the last 2 months, versus the white unemployment rate remains in the 3.5% range. And so my argument with this book, and from a Black nationalist framework, is that especially in times such as these economic times that we're in currently today in 2025, we would not have to worry so much about a Black unemployment rate if we had strong Black economic institutions that are strong enough to hire our own people, and to insulate us from these economic downturns. Because unfortunately, the Black unemployment rate has always been consistently, since the late 1980s, has always consistently been twice that of the white unemployment rate. And so, but it's not just about unemployment, obviously, which is a big deal, but it's also about ownership, business ownership. And so the African American, our community, we don't own enough businesses in order to employ our people. And a lot of times the businesses that we do own are sole proprietors, to the point where we're not hiring our own people. It's a single, maybe you have maybe one or two other employees, and that's it. Versus white-owned institutions, that's not the case. Versus other ethnic groups, which I talk about in the group, that's not the case. So then when you have these economic downturns, it becomes a huge issue for the African American. And so I wrote an article a couple of years ago that talks about the wealth gap between the African American and other ethnic groups, and especially white society. And I argue that by 2050, the wealth of the African American is going to devolve to zero, which we are clearly on that path and probably will reach it before 2050, because we don't have the economic, not only institutions, but the businesses for the institutions to fund in order with Black dollars, in order to make sure that we're stable as a community economically. And so if you don't have a stable economic community, then your education is going to be the subject to the will of others, which in this case, the others is white society, in which we're not being educated, the African American is not being educated within this society to solve its own problems. The African American is educated to solve the problems of its oppressor, which in this case is white society. So, so if you're not educated to solve your own problems, then that also creates issues as far as socially as well. So it's just one big ecosystem. And it was a real opportunity in the 60s in the post-civil rights era to address that after the assassination of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. Clearly, Dr. Martin Luther King, most would classify him as an integrationist, as you said, but he did have some ideals for Black power and Black nationalism, because Dr. King talked about reparations, which I talk about in the book, talking about the African American coming to get their check from from Washington D.C. and think about Dr. King's seminal speech at the March on Washington. We would just call it the March on Washington, but it was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, right? So, so Dr. King definitely had a nationalist sort of tilt to his messaging, especially after as the Vietnam War started kicking up, grumbling in 1965 and started progressing, and all of the things that we faced as a nation in that time period. But that part of it is left out. And so again, with the death of Dr. King, the death of Malcolm X, and the subjugation of other freedom fighters in the late 60s going into the 1970s, you see Assata Shakur, rest in peace, she just died recently in Cuba, her escape to Cuba, the subjugation by the FBI of the Black Panther Party, and all these different things going on really killed the Black nationalist framework and messaging. And so from that point on, now, as African Americans, we exist in this country, really not being able to solve our own problems and get ahead of the challenges that we face from yesteryear and going in the present and going into the future.
Yeah, there are a lot of things in what you said that strike me as being relevant to today's society, and chiefly among them, again, with your role as an educator, it's that Black students are often taught in public schools to solve the problems of a society that, sort of also alienates them in the process. So we find that in cases where people from like disenfranchised communities are put into these public schools and they are told that this is like opportunity for themselves to like evolve or be put on put on a higher level. But in the same scenario, these people are then alienated from their communities. They're put into high-ranking positions of a power if they do get an education, and then there's like a mutual actual hostility between them and their communities, where their community, looks down upon them as sort of being a traitor. And then they look down upon their community because they believe that their community simply does not understand the power of what it is that they're doing. But in effect, these two groups are they're disenfranchised from one another. I find that very interesting. There's also another topic that you brought up regarding Asata Shakur. I was actually going to mention her, actually being quite, I'll admit, unaware of the fact that she recently passed away. But there are a lot of things happening during the period around which she was active that are very relevant to the topic of your book. And notably among them, I also wanted to bring up the idea that you had actually explained just a few moments prior, which was of you called it like the different like cross-flagging, all these different like movements actually coming together. And in doing so, you described how the integrationists and actual Black nationalists had themselves also had some interplay. They believed in some of the same ideas. They believed in enhancing the power of the Black community, but they did not necessarily agree on the ways to do it. And in the same way, you brought up how there are a lot of other similar movements that also seek to abolish the same systems which gave an issue to the actual Black Americans that are also themselves not involved in these causes. So I want to talk about that. There is a lot of talk about these days, primarily like cross-sectional and stuff like that. There's a lot of talk about how all of these different movements from different groups of people advocating for themselves often seem to head towards the same policies. There is a lot of alliances between potential heads of these movements. There's also a lot of hostilities. So how do you see the role of all of these like black nationalist movements? How do you see them evolving in an era where one of the most like hotly debated political issues is things like such as Israel or Palestine, where events that are happening across the globe, whether they be in China or somewhere in Africa, where there's currently, the raging war in Libya, or surrounding it in Western Asia and Yemen, where there's the war in Sudan, where there's a lot of different things happening all across the globe and a lot of secessionist movements. How do you see these different roles interplaying? Because something that I found fascinating in my research is the involvement between people who had supported like the IRA in Ireland and like the involvement of Black Americans who were advocating for civil rights within the United States. There seemed to be an interplay there, which you would not think would have happened, but thanks to the, actual power of connection and how quickly communication technology had evolved, there had been that link. So I can only imagine how strong of a link that would be in a modern age where digital communication is so quick that you could talk to somebody across the globe in a matter of seconds. So in an environment such as this, with all these different movements happening all around the world, what is the role of Black nationalists today?
That is great question. So I think the role of Black nationalism today, we have to hone down on the results, right? So you can do a lot of things, we can say a lot of things, we can advocate for a lot of things, but at the end of the day, the results have to be there as far as in the form of policy and in the form of economic development. And so I think that the having the support of other groups across the globe is great, and being able to pattern what they see that the African American is doing in order to secure itself for the future. But the issue is that, and I constantly struggle with this question, is again, what is the African American in America doing today to secure its future, economically, socially, educationally, and politically, within a nationalist lens? What are we doing to do that? And so I constantly struggle with that question because, as it stands today, as I said before, we don't really have our own institutions, especially economically and especially even politically. Now, some people point to the fact that President Barack Obama won 2 terms, and now you have Hakeem Jeffries. So you have all these different people who are Black faces who in high places, so to speak. But again, the question is, but what does that have to do with a nationalist identity? In order to secure the future of the African American, both economically, politically, and culturally, in all 3 phases. You see, and so I think that's where the confusion lies in from even African Americans within our own community, because sometimes we get bogged down into these different discussions. You have, for example, discussions about lineage versus lineage, where it entails people who were born in the United States who are of African American descent, so they descend from chattel slavery, versus people who their lineage derives from a foreign country, and their family immigrated here. Or you may have a debate about straight Black men compared to other groups who are not Black men within the Black community. So we get bogged down into all of these different conversations, and what happens is an agenda doesn't happen because we're so bogged down into these conversations. So what I think is that the African American can learn a thing or two from other groups around the globe who are in the struggle to securing their freedom and their existence. You know, we just, like you said, we just saw the news with the Palestinians and in Israel, right? And so obviously that's a very complicated discussion, given the fact that, you know, that's a conflict that has been for millennia. You know, so that's a very it's a very uh, different discussion, but still the meat and potatoes of oppression is still there. And how do you, as an oppressed group, contend with oppression and ultimately rise above it and secure your freedom? You know, that, like as you said, that conversation is around the whole globe currently right now. So I do believe if we as the African American are able to get past our own battles within our culture and ethnicity, then and kind of see what other groups are doing to secure, you know, at least attempted to secure their freedom and their liberation against the people who are oppressed or the systems that are oppressing them, then I think that would be very very effective for us. But we first have to get past the little arguments, and when I say little, I'm saying within the grand scheme of things, because the discussion of lineage is very important when you talk about reparations. It's very important. And I am one of those who believe that if your family derives from the chattel slavery in this country, then yes, that entitles you to reparations. But we got to get to the point of getting reparations, like having that even on the table from the federal government and also state governments, local governments. So you look at, for example, we're in Florida. You look at what happened with the Rosewood, the descendants of Rosewood. They received reparations in the mid-90s, and I talk about that in my book. And the process for how they were able to get to that point, especially in a state like Florida, even in the 1990s, where it was more
conservatively
blue, you know. So you know, even, you know, but still, they were able to achieve that. So so I think that has to be and to be honest, the only way you're really going to even get to address that issue, to me, you almost have to create a separate party that centers on that issue. Because there is not going to be any major party in the United States that's going to have reparations on that platform. Now, the Green Party had reparations on their platform for the descendants of chattel slavery of African descent here in America. So the Green Party did have that on their platform for going on two election cycles now. So so that's a testament to the noise or the energy that has been bubbling up in this time of social media, as you said, with the communication of the grassroots, you know, to make sure that's on a major platform. But as far as that being on the platform for Democrat and Republican Party, you know, again, that's going to really take some internal reflection of our community, and to really make that a large enough issue for this society to take that as serious enough to put that on a major political platform. So I do think anything centered around liberation for the African American in this moment centers around reparations, you know, centers around reparations. And then from there, I believe all of the other issues will begin to sort itself out, because with reparations, you're addressing the immediate economic concerns of the African American.
Sure. There are a lot of interesting things again in what you said. Number one among them is, I believe, the town that you mentioned, Rosewood. It's interesting that you can sort of take information out from that entire situation that happened in the 90s, as you said, and you can form a sort of guidebook for how such a process would be achieved in the future. It seems that, it's the entire process of learning from history. So it's interesting to me that you brought it up. But another factor that I consider to be quite intrinsic to the debate is that you mentioned just a few minutes prior, how there is a comparative difference between second generation immigrants from other countries and people who were brought to the United States on chattel slavery around, 150, 200, 250 years ago.
Mhm.
There's a comparative difference because in a modern American cultural landscape, we can consider the people who were brought here on chattel slavery to be sort of, ethnically Americans. Their families have been here for far longer than most people's families have actually been here.
Yes.
And it is very interesting when we compare that to like second generation immigrants because second generation immigrants from African countries, or more primarily actually we see in Florida, countries like Haiti, countries like the
Mhm.
Dominican Republic, like Jamaica,
Mhm.
sometimes even Cuba. We see people come here from these countries, and it's almost like they're thrust into a system that has been engineered for the past like almost 200 years to separate different kinds of people, not only based like on their economic status, but also based on how they identify ethnically. And there's also always, a sort of conflict, like how does this happen? Are these people, do they have the same background? Who has been in this fight the longest, etc. I want to narrow that down and talk about some of the more influences of Black nationalism throughout history. So, for reading your book and also for reading the preview of your book, for reading similar books on the same topics, there are two names that often pop up, and those names are Marcus Garvey, and then less often, but also sometimes there's Edward Blyden. So these are two distinctly different visions, again, we see, of pretty much the same sentiment that arose in, let's say, the early 19th century. So Edward Blyden has this vision of like African redemption and Afrofuturism, and we can make comparisons on how it affects like digital diasporic identity with all these different people, as you said, all around the world, sort of having a way to connect. But it also serves as an analogy in the modern day because of how we see, all these different communities all around the world, particularly in now the nominally decolonized African countries, and how all these economies develop. And then with Marcus Garvey, we see a message that is perhaps somewhat more influential because he had this whole idea of like Pan-African economic independence. And in some ways, though not in all ways, that ties into a lot of modern Black nationalists today. So between these two figures, what is the difference that you see? Which one of their ideas applies more? Are some of their ideas like antiquated and they no longer apply to the modern like cultural history? Are
Mhm.
there misassumptions that people have about these figures the same way that people often do about MLK or Malcolm X?
Right. So there is a distinct difference um, between the two, right?
Yeah.
There are definitely a lot of similarities. Obviously both advocated for the African American to immigrate to Africa, right, in some way, shape,
Hmm.
or form. But I'll say this. So for Garvey, he is the most recognized of Black nationals
Yes.
because of the organization that he built in the early 1900s, and how he was deported from America to the UK, and his journey, his journey, and then also to um, obviously his influence with Rastafarianism,
Hmm.
so that type of thing. But the thing that, and I'll talk about this in the book with Marcus Garvey, that a lot of people don't know, but I mean, you can kind of see, some people may interpret it as a negative. I don't. I just kind of see him more as a man of his time. Was what he wanted to do with, because the question, okay, yes, he wanted to immigrate to West Africa, but what did he want to do? So his thought process was, there was, and I talk about this in the book, there was a conference in the 19, after the First World War, right?
Yes.
And it was to divide up the territories that Germany had in West Africa.
Yeah.
And so what happened was that Garvey's organization comes to that conference, and they wanted to take control of it, which is a great idea. But the issue was that he wanted to install people, and he said this specifically, his people, mind you, who wrote the document for it, that they wanted to install people who were educated in Western schools
Hmm.
to be appointed over that territory that they theoretically Marcus Garvey's movement organization would take over.
Hmm.
And so I comment in the book that, this is one of those things where, again, Garvey is a man of his time, not trusting that the natives can really govern themselves,
Hmm.
you see. And so, versus Blyden, he moved to West Africa, right? So, he moved to Sierra Leone, and with what he wanted to do, he taught. He was a teacher, and he taught about the unification in Africa, and so people in Africa uniting. And so a lot of his theories were the basis for who you would see like Kwame Nkrumah and some of these other people, and even to a degree influencing Marcus Garvey as well. Um, but so again, they had similarities, they had some differences, and I think today in this global economy, unfortunately, a lot of people view Pan-Africanism, because that's what we're talking about here, which is a derivative of Black nationalism. A lot of people view that as a negative, here in America, view that as America because they feel that it still doesn't really address the plight of the African American. Now,
Yeah.
what I would say is that it may not address the plight of the African American directly in this immediate time, but I do believe there is room for Pan Africanism there is room for it because, as you can see, we are a global economy,
Yeah.
global economy. And if we're talking about having Black nationalism, where you're going to have to build economic foundations in this country, not only having just Black owned business, but you're going to have Black owned production, right? Where is that production going to come from? Is it going to come from, and when I say production, I'm specifically talking about manufacturing.
Hmm.
Is that going to come from in this country? Or would that come from other countries? So currently, as it stands now, China is the manufacturing hub for American products, right? And so I believe that if the African American and by way of just the African diaspora in general is going to have some independence, we have to start thinking about our own production and where would that come from. I do believe that there are countries in Africa who would be ripe for to serve as a sort of manufacturing hub, not only just for African Americans, but for the diaspora at large. For those who want to engage in commerce. But the issue is that again, where is this money going to come from? How will the African American and then other uh, uh, groups, Black groups throughout, let's just say the West, for example, where we're talking about Caribbean countries or countries in South America, those Black populations, how are we, and when I say we, I'm talking about just in general, Black, within the Western Hemisphere, how are we going to have our own economic basis if we don't have our own manufacturing, if we don't have our own systems for distribution, you see? So
Hmm.
these are the different things that other ethnic groups who come to this country have access to at a very high volume. Whether you want to talk about Asian immigrants and then kind of break that up into Chinese immigrants or Japanese immigrants, Indian immigrants, so a lot of these different groups who come from different countries, they have access to large scale manufacturing in their home countries or countries that share similar history and culture. So does the African American have access to that? Currently, as it stands, no. So that's where I do believe within the Black nationalist framework, there is room for a Pan African. Not saying that you have to return back to Africa, but just more so if African countries, so even the most stable of ones, so for example, if you want to talk about uh, Ghana, you know, a country like Ghana, I do believe would serve as a test case for this, the manufacturing. Be able to develop some sort of manufacturing, and then to be able to where people, not just people of African descent, but anybody, because you got to build your money up, can have access to their manufacturing, pay fair prices, and then they'll be able to export. Now, obviously, that would come down to the countries that these people of African descent, whether you're talking about the United States or Jamaica or Haiti or any of these countries, are these countries negotiating to have fair trade and to have diplomatic relations that can develop manufacturing to where, okay, if I want to go on, because currently as it stands, I could go on, Alibaba or Alibaba Express or whatever, and have
Hmm.
direct contact with the Chinese manufacturer. So can I be able to do that with the country in Africa? You see what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
that's where I think, and that's where I think, and I do believe that the African American as a whole, I mean, we are $1 trillion uh, industry unto itself when it comes to certain products. You know, so I believe that you're going to have a system like that is going to have to play a crucial role again in our economic liberation.
Yeah. There are a lot of different topics that you brought up, foremost among them the sort of trade that the US does with China, how in African economies that sort of trade is often not possible. There was a lot of inferences given towards, this entire idea of the focus not being on the actual African American, with it being spiraled elsewhere, with these sorts of conflicts dividing people. So. Foremost among this, I see that you are coming, at a lot of these topics from a very academic background, which is rare to see in a modern day because there is a very distinct effort to sort of undermine academic voices that are coming from this angle, particularly from this angle of what can we do, rather than this is the history and I'm going to present it as such. That sort of like organizational power is often undermined. So we're looking towards these cases, and more often than not, there's this educational gap between people on the issues that have to deal with Black African American history and then African American nationalism. So there is this conglomerate of people who commonly believe that the issue itself, as I touched in the beginning of the podcast, comes in a very few angles in American history, and it is not repeated. Uh, Meanwhile, we are talking about very much global history, and there's one case that presents itself in something that you mentioned. You mentioned how Marcus Garvey tried to approach the conference in dividing the former German colonies, and I actually read something about this, and it proves a very like ill-twisted fate that one of these colonies, Namibia, was then later
Mhm.
decided to not become independent. It did not decide by itself, but it was decided that this country would not become independent, and it was instead given to apartheid South Africa. So for the
Yes.
next like 50 or 60 years, rather than
Yes.
being ceded, independence or given, even minimal autonomy, because all of these viewpoints were seen, as radical and as being just too much. Even the point of view of Western leaders leading it, even the point of view of some colonial autonomy or dominion, and especially the point of view of the native people actually ruling the country and having some sort of self-autonomy. It was viewed as so radical that the entire province was then put into apartheid South Africa, and then it proceeded to go through that entire process for the next 40 or 50 years until the region finally gained independence. So there's a lot of very like global historical issues that tend to stem from this. But when you're looking at that sort of history being taught in the United States, we don't get a clear picture of it, particularly as I said before in American public schools. So what do you think are the biggest misconceptions that are pretty much festered among the population, the biggest misconceptions about Black and African American history that are put forward in the curriculum or actually tangentially on purpose manipulated in order to give students a different view of history in schools across this country rather than what actually happened? What are some of like the major contentions that are just not being discussed? What are points of history that are spared by omission? People like Marcus Garvey get occasionally mentioned, but history aside from that is not often talked about.
Well, that's a great question. So I think how education is taught in schools, you look at the definition of history. History is his story.
Yeah.
So to the victor goes the spoils, right? So it's automatically going to be a slant, especially in the American public education system, because when you talk about white supremacy, that's part of it. Part of it is concealing, not telling certain things. You maybe mention certain things, but you don't tell the full picture of how that was developed, right?
Mhm.
Because it's his story. So you have to keep up the appearances, the pristine appearances of Americanism, of American nationalism, right? You have to keep that up. And part of it is the telling of a certain, telling the story, his story, a certain way to make sure that the your citizens um, continue to obey, right? And so my thing is that when it comes to the telling of history in American public school system, not even just the public schools, in private schools or whatever system, again, the full picture is never going to be told, ever. It's never going to be told. And so, because if you look at like our population today, understanding certain things such as the 14th Amendment or the 15th Amendment or just the Constitution, what that really entails, what is the three-fifths compromise, how that came about, what was the psychology of the three-fifths compromise, and how that set the foundation still to this day as far as how we perceive the African American. Literally, we have examples throughout history since that time period as still being perceived as three-fifths of existence, And so when I think about, to your point and to your question about how history is told and why certain things are not being told, again, it goes back to white supremacy. The system of white supremacy, the greatest tool of white supremacy is confusion. The more you keep your population confused in the system of white supremacy, the more you can do to get over on that population. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about white, black, Latino, immigrants, non-immigrant. It doesn't matter. The United States is built on the system of white supremacy. And so its goal is to maintain hegemonic power throughout the world. And so, in order to maintain that power, you have to make sure that your population is being told um, things that you want it to, for how you want it to be perceived in order for that power to be maintained. So when we hear about um, a boat off of Venezuela in Venezuela, off the Venezuelan coast, being blown to smithereens, without any real due process. You know, most of America don't really understand the so-called justice system and the intricacies of it, especially when you're talking about an international. The news media plays a very important role into that. It used to be, back in the, this up until the 60s and 70s, they used to broadcast war right there. That you could find footage of the Vietnam War being broadcasted um, as part of the news hour. Nowadays, that doesn't happen. You may have the news, maybe some bombs in a truck in the background or something like that, but actual war is not being broadcast. Again, that's that's part of the concealing process. We don't think much. We don't see how serious that is. Or even today, when we talk about mass shootings and those type of things, we just hear about it and we just keep going, right? And so again, that goes back to my point about history. And when you're talking about specifically African American history, which is American history, when you talk about that, a lot of the finer points are going to be left out, because if I believe if the African American was really educated to its in full about the history of this country and how the history of how this country used us as footstools to maintain white supremacy, even up until this day and age, and will continue to do so in the future. I don't believe that the African American would be as as calm as we are in this time, in this moment. I don't believe that, but because of the way we are educated in this country, because of the way that capitalism is in this country, it's a rat race. Getting to the bag. Getting to the bag takes more precedence over building generational wealth. To secure your children and your community. Because of that, I believe that it's just left us in a state of of I don't want to say docile, because I don't believe that we are a docile people. I believe the opposite, but I don't believe that we are channeling our energy in the right direction to build to secure our economic freedom. So history plays the teaching of history and how it's taught in schools play a very important role in that. And and which is why I believe in African centered education institutions. And when I say African centered, is not the motherland of Africa. Is just more so harkening back to the African American experience and centering our curriculum, within that African centered education institution, centering the African American experience in the curriculum, so that we learn how to solve our own problems. We learn our own history in full, and then being able to solve our own problems, and then not to just be educated to go to school just to get a good job, but being educated to create jobs within our community. That's the difference. Where you can make an argument, nobody's really being educated even to do that much. Most of our education system is
How to be a good employee, yeah.
It's just centered around going to school, get a good job, and it stops there. But but the African American is particularly hurts us because at least in whether you want to talk about in white society or immigrants that come here, job creation, they have that particular knowledge. The African American has that knowledge also, but it's not pronounced today. So that's the issue.
Yeah. I think there are a lot of parallels in what you were saying and what I wanted to talk about next. But the critiques that you made addressing towards capitalism, I find that the sentiments that we've actually echoed on this podcast when we were talking a lot about like philosophical discussions and like also centered on this like rat race analogy, where everybody's in this rat race and you're trying to get to the end of it. But when you get to the end of it and you're, let's say, financially secure and you don't have to work again a day of your life, I mean, at the end of the day, you're still a rat because by running in this race, you're also by proxy, empowering the same system that keeps you channeled and tied to this race. But then at the very end of the equation comes across the very obvious fact that a lot of people themselves are going to be disenfranchised simply because they aren't participating in it. So it's almost like a choice, like do you participate in this very unethical system that is going to kick you down simply because of who you are, or do you not do anything and then you suffer as a result? It's often, a very bad choice to make because either way, you are ending up in a more disadvantaged situation. So I think that critique towards capitalism really nicely meshes in here, but I want to talk more about the more cultural and political side of it nowadays. There was obviously a very heavy interclash between cultural and political advocates, not only in the civil rights era but prior to that in the abolitionist era, when we're talking about African American history. But it was interesting to me that you mentioned legislation that was being proposed by the Green Party towards reparations. And my original question was going to be, what do you think like the greatest opposition to reparations? Where does it come from in the United States? But I think that question can be more broadly expanded to how do you see like the role of the actual like Democratic Party and the Green Party in the future of let's say this concept of black nationalism. Where do you see like these parties clashing with the general community? You mentioned people like Hakeem Jeffries and how people believe that because black African Americans are in high positions of power, that automatically means that the United States of America cannot be in any reasonable way a racist society. But then we see a lot of these people are themselves like educated, very high up, and they're put in these positions of power, which admittedly only have a certain amount of influence. And then we see into the broad, coalitions. We cannot reasonably assume that the Republican Party is going to be advocating for reparations anytime in the next several hundred years. We also cannot reasonably assume, however, that the Democratic Party is also going to get on board with this more progressive agenda because they themselves see themselves as like losing the battle, sort of the Republicans. They think that because they are losing elections, that it is their economic policy and it is their, social programs that are unpopular among the, American voter base. So naturally, whenever anything goes wrong, whenever they lose an election, it is actually the case that the Democratic Party then proceeds to push back on a lot of the social programs that it has pioneered for African Americans and Asian Americans and a lot of like the more progressive education. Because they think that by pushing back on these matters, they're going to attract, back to Republicans who hate critical race theory and apparently is the belief of the Democratic Party that simply by revoking these things, they are themselves making themselves more electable. And we see this sort of process whenever the Democrats tend to lose an election. They tend to go back on a lot of the promises that they made to these smaller communities because they view them as too controversial, and they simply, focus on the meat and the butter of it, which is appealing to the corporate donors. So in a society such as this, and in the modern American cultural landscape, and in a world where you have to sort of pander to all these sorts of political groups in order to even get legislation passed for Congress, what is like the role of African Americans who are trying to secure generational wealth, as you said, on a political basis? What is the hope? Seeing the history of the Democratic Party as a party that has historically been anti-black, what is the hope for these people to actually get political change through if Black Americans cannot rely on the Democratic Party to pass their promises through Congress? How do you see like this intersection between culture and politics?
Oh, that's a great question. It reminds me the intersection between culture and politics reminds me of the 2020 campaign between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, right?
Yeah.
And so if you remember, Joe Biden was losing in the Democratic primaries in 2020. And then he went on the Breakfast Club and said, "You ain't black if you don't vote for me." And black people basically saved his campaign. And in that moment, and I talk about this in the book, and in that moment, I realized that, man, like this is really something that politicians, are going on, are more and more going on these different types of podcasts, like with the Breakfast Club and Drink Champs and some of these other Kai Sanat, are going on these podcasts. And so the culture and the politics is definitely clashing. So I brought up the Biden thing because Biden went on to win a nomination and then he went on to win the presidency. But what happened was that because of that, it delayed the inevitable. People tell me, oh, with Trump and MAGA. And the thing about it is that, well, in my view, if the African American had punished Joe Biden for saying that if you ain't black, you don't vote for me, because what that does is, from a cultural perspective, that whittles down the at him Joe Biden as a white man, a very powerful white man throughout his almost near 50-year career in politics is very powerful. And for him to whittle down the African American community to just a vote, which you can make the argument he's always done that, but specifically in that moment and in the moment of him needing the African American vote, not only to win the nomination, but to defeat Donald Trump. If you go back and look at the polling data, for us as African Americans, it was a real opportunity to use our vote as real leverage against him and to get some headway into some specific policies for the African American. It was a real opportunity to say, hey, if you don't have reparations, a serious reparations platform, or reparations agenda on your platform, then we're not going to vote for you. We didn't do that. He went on to win the presidency, and it delayed the inevitable. In his state of mind, he didn't even have the decency to say, hey, I have this, I have Kamala Harris here, who, Kamala says she has Black ancestry. Now you can argue, where is that Black ancestry from? Who cares at this point? But at the end of the day, she has some Black ancestry. And for him not to have the decency to say, okay, I won the presidency, but because of my mental, my health disparity or decline, I'm going to not run in the next election. Let's have a primary, right? So for
No
him not,
primary.
for him not to do that, is him to keep saying, oh yeah, I gotta run again to beat Donald Trump again, while his mental faculties or allegedly are declining, and then he gets the nomination again, but then within 107 days before the election, just pass it off to Kamala Harris. That really, to me, that really hurt, because or really goes to my larger point, is that you can't rely on the African American can't rely on democratic politics, because at the end of the day, the whole idea of the Democratic Party, just like Republicans, is to maintain white supremacy. And so Now, how they go about it, one can argue and say that they may go about it differently. But then I ask the question, well, how differently? It was Democrats who signed the crime bill, who Joe Biden authored that. Bill Clinton signed it into law. It was the Democrats in the 80s, Joe Biden specifically, the 1982 crime bill, the 1986 crime bill, the 1988 crime bill. Remember when crack was a big deal, and the sentencing disparities. Democrats voted for that. Joe Biden authored those bills in conjunction with what's his name, the senator from
Strom Thurmond.
Strom Thurmond. There we go, and Byrd. So again, when people tell me, well, Democrat, well, how different are they when we're talking about policy? They may be different, but they're not, maybe not talking about. You might not see the white supremacy in them as far as their messaging, but the policies. What is the difference if you really analyze the policies that they created, especially Joe Biden? Why did he deserve our vote in that moment of 2020? Well, people say, well, because we didn't want Donald Trump to win. Okay, you didn't want Donald Trump to win, but look at it in hindsight. If Donald Trump would have won in 2020, MAGA would have been over by now.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been over. But
Yes.
instead, you delayed it. It's 2028 and maybe even beyond now, depending on how they look at Vance. So that's that's my thing when it comes to this politics thing, is that unfortunately the African American has been used and Malcolm X said this back in the 60s, as a tool in the political football. And so others benefit while we don't, while we, the African American, don't benefit. You can say, well, we benefit as far as Civil Rights Act, but guess what? There were Republicans who voted for Civil Rights Act also, and the voter, because they recognize, okay, there's a gain here. When it comes to rights, it may be beneficial for the African American to go to a white diner and spend their dollars in a white diner.
Yeah.
And they were right, because guess what? It destroyed Black-owned businesses, because we took our dollars from our strong Black-owned businesses and then took that to the white restaurants because we wanted to taste that food of the white restaurant. It took our admissions in the historically Black colleges and universities, and I'm guilty of this as well, and went to the white schools. You see, so again, we gotta look at the end game to everything when we're talking about politics. What is the best interest of the community? The best interest, and I think that we have not been so nuanced in analyzing this. We get caught up in the faces, the Black faces in high places, but not in, well, what is the end result to everything that we're talking about here? And so, as it may be with the Democratic Party, I believe that if the African American continues to hitch its liberation on any of these parties, on the Democrat or the Republican Party, but especially the Democratic Party, then it's gonna be in a state that you can't return from. I think we still are able to turn the tide now in this moment. I think there's still a slither of hope to do that economically because of different things that are coming about in the global economic sector. You look at different ways of e-commerce and crypto and that type of thing. There is, but you have to have leaders in the community who are talking about these things and going about the strategy. So I don't think enough of the African American leaders are talking about these strategies in ways to build wealth, in ways to secure a type of education curriculum to help our to not just help, but to elevate the African American culture. When it comes to culture, what I used to often ask this question in class when I taught, what is the African American culture today? What does that center on? And it and you have students who deeply ponder that, who are of African American, and they can't really say what it is. And I understand why, because they have been educated in the system to the point where you're so educated in what you're interested in that you really don't know what African American culture is, even at a basic level, historically or in this present moment. So we have to get to that point first in order to get to to trudge on to our liberation.
Yeah. Uh, Again, a lot of things in what you just said, and I just want to break it down slowly. There's one thing that struck me as particularly impactful, which is the whole equality argument. And there's, the argument that the civil rights era had achieved equality for the African American. But then when we look at it, exactly the symptoms of what you described had happened, where politicians actually viewed it as beneficial, that Black Americans would take their money and go spend it at white diners and go get their food, as that would, destroy the actual institutions that Black Americans had built in parallel to the white institutions in order to enfranchise their communities, in order to hire their own people, in order to bring dollars back to their, families. The sort of parallel institutions that had been built because the African Americans had been excluded from a white society, and that was viewed as very beneficial to those communities themselves. But politicians had taken advantage of this, and in so doing, the actual civil rights bill had allowed by proxy all African Americans to slowly and gradually come to white universities. They had allowed them to go spend money at white fast food restaurants and white diners, and then come to, work at white-owned businesses.
Right.
And this was done in the name of equality.
Right.
There's this very much, argument of, oh, we'll hire this, token black person, we'll hire a
Mm-hmm.
token Asian person, and then they can see that we are not racist. But in
Mm.
proxy, every single time that this was done, a person was taken away from their community where they could have done real good by employing their family, by employing their
Mm-hmm.
friends, people that they had been raised alongside. And this had actually, made this, whole brain drain throughout the decades and generations, where now it is also somewhat inconceivable that people would work alongside their communities if we're not talking about what we previously talked about, which is like the second generation immigrants. And this is where that divide comes along again, from what I understand, where if you're a second generation Nigerian immigrant and you come with like a huge Nigerian family, then it is actually more likely that you're going to start your own business. We see this a lot with Asian Americans. They're some of the largest business owners in the United States because they have this, vision of, we're going to work for our community, we're going to do this, and then I'm going to supply for my family, I'm going to build generational wealth this way. And a lot of Asian Americans have been very successful for doing this. They have climbed through the ladders of power and they have become quite rich. But we don't see this in Black American communities because a lot of them are simply, descendants of people who have lived here since the Mayflower days, since chattel slavery for over 200, 250 years. We don't see this we don't see this whole pragmatism that we see on the Asian American side,
Right.
uh, because we don't see the whole pragmatism coming from immigrants that want to build the generational wealth, since the vast majority of African Americans are not immigrants. And now, we come down from the issue of institutions into the whole Democratic Party, and that often perils in of itself. You mentioned Joe Biden and Trump firm and how they were co-signing legislation. There's pictures of them like hugging together and all that sort of crap. We see how the Democratic Party has failed to admit to stuff like this. But even nowadays, we see the hypocrisy in the name, where it's called the Democratic Party. They're not hosting an open Democratic primary. It's called the Democratic Party. But instead of offering alternatives for people to vote for minor candidates that may parallel their issues, they only take people from the Democratic mainstream. And let's say they put like one token minority or two token minorities in there. And then they have the big name, white politicians such as Joe Biden, such as the guy Michael Bloomberg in the 2020, presidential election cycle. If you have enough money and if you have enough support among the legislators, then they're going to allow you up on that stage.
Right.
Otherwise, forget about, any alternatives. You can't run as an independent party unless it's a very, very local election.
Mm.
So we're seeing that the Democratic Party is very, frequently choosing to advantage its own people over those of minority interests. And that takes me back to, I believe, one of the final questions that I really wanted to ask. The entire thing that you mentioned in your book regarding this very specific town and how it had obtained reparations, coming from like a more local perspective, because I'm located in Florida as well, and a lot of the issues that you describe very much affect Florida because it is a very, diverse state.
Right.
Um, where do you see like these examples from history where African Americans were actually able to, create some form of advantage for themselves, whether it be politically, economically, in those kinds of situations? Where do you see those examples leading us? By following those examples, where will America be in 25, 50 years? What are some specific key takeaways from your research and from history that you believe would advantage African Americans in the long run were they to follow alongside this footpath that was, set for them previously?
Right. Yeah, I think the blueprint, has been set in a sense of with the African American,
Hmm.
we have to I don't now I'm not saying that we have to and I do believe in a certain part of it, but I'm not saying necessarily that we have to all buy some land and get a and crowd around in a town
Hmm.
to ourselves, and build black enclaves as far as towns in order to be successful. I'm not saying that it would be great, but that's not the only way to be successful, is what I'm trying to say. I believe that in the current environment, the economic environment, I believe that there is a lot of opportunity for people of all walks of life within the African diaspora, but especially African Americans here in America,
Hmm.
in order to form collectives and build wealth. One of the quickest ways to do that is the investment in property. You know, I believe that there's a lot of opportunity still for property. You see it, as you said, with immigrants who come to this country. One of the first things they do is invest in property. You know, I believe even if that means that you have to kind of sacrifice some discretionary income a little bit, but in the long run you have to be able to see the vision. In 3 years, 5 years, there's going to be some equity in this property. We can use the equity in this property and then go buy another property and keep it going. And I believe there's some room for that, even to do that with individuals who may not even be in your immediate family, but who you may be very close to and trust, and you have the right economic vision. So I believe that there is room for that, and so kind of sort of to build like a new version of a Black Wall Street, right? You don't necessarily have to live together, but you still be able to coordinate together, in order to build that generational wealth, which entails cooperation. But even in order to get to that, and it's something I talk about in the book, we have to get our families intact first, and that goes to culture. We have to get our families intact. We have to be able, and this may ruffle some feathers, but we have to be able to get back to the basics of of family. No matter what that looks like. Family is the lifeblood of the wealth building. You see this with the other cultures that immigrate to this country. They have a very strong family base. And so without that strong family base, and unfortunately, the African American has literally been created in this country to not have a strong family base, which then
Hmm.
goes into the not having a good economic base, and then so it all flows from the family. So I do believe that we have to get back to those family values, no matter what it looks like, what it entails. At the end of the day, they're still family, because when it comes down to actually creating a business or owning a business, you have to rely on family. You have to. rely on family to really, or if you talk about property, you have to really rely on family in order to make certain technical things of that to work, you know. And I don't, so in this moment of 2025, unfortunately, I don't believe that we as the African American are placing enough emphasis on having strong nuclear families. I think we fall into the trap of our oppressors, looking at what they do, thinking that, you know, we could do the same thing, all the while that it hurts us much more because because if you don't have a unified family structure, you know, because when you have nuclear family, that comes with structure. So when you don't have structure, when you don't have nuclear family formation, then again the prospects of confusion comes into play here, and then so now you're just kind of just on survival mode because you don't have family that you support or supports you. You don't have that. So now you're just strictly survival mode. And if you're always in survival mode, then you can't get into wealth building mode because you're in survival mode. So that's been the problem also, which we didn't really touch on, but you know, touching on it now, that cultural aspect. I believe that we as African American have to get back to, and when I say back, I say that because we had it. We had it immediately after enslavement. We had that. And you saw the progress that we made with literacy and in the economic gains and even in the political arena that we made from 1870 to 1888. You know, we had that strong nuclear family. So, so I believe that we have to get back to that in order to really assess and address, in part, our plight in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Adejumo, we touched upon a lot of topics in this interview. Summarizing pretty much all of the keywords that we talked about and all of the influential figures that we discussed, a lot of them can be found in your book. So I
Mm-hmm.
want to touch down very briefly at the end towards your book, The Return of Black Nationalism and the Death of White Supremacy. You had a foreword by Dr. Adeyemi Doss.
Mm-hmm.
You had original cover art, which I quite liked because it seemed to represent a lot of a lot of the themes that were contained within your book. It seemed very, adaptive to the kind of energy that you were speaking across with, where it was this you're speaking directly from what must be done rather than, oh, here's like a brief cover and a history and we're just going to talk about this really briefly and then you can go on in your merry way. So I found that quite inspiring. There was a lot of different aspects of the book in itself and the actual writing, which covered parts of Black nationalism and African American history that a lot of people don't think about. Just from the pieces that I had actually read because there was not enough time to actually read the whole book, but just from the pieces that I had itself read, there was a lot of very interesting parallels. Just, to quickly ask, what is that you wanted to accomplish with this book? What was the process behind writing it? What do you hope that potential readers will get from it? And where do you intend to go as far as writing goes in the future?
Great question. So the process of writing the book, again, stems from years ago. Well, basically my experience first as a Black man in America. But second off, my experience in the academy, and certain things that I experienced, even in teaching African American studies, I felt that certain things within the program were not addressed. And, you know, I try to address those things with my courses that I taught. So I taught a course on Black Wall Street, which
Mm-hmm.
talks about the economic history of African Americans here in this country, but also is solutions oriented. I literally made my students write a business plan
Yeah.
and go on the IRS website and learn how to register a employer identification number and understand what an LLC is, and so I made my students do that, and years later they still appreciate me for that. I taught a course called Black Masculinity because I felt and still feel to this day that masculinity isn't really understood in this country, much less Black masculinity,
Hmm.
in the development of that. So, so those two courses, teaching those two courses, and then answering a lot of questions from students, and then also going on speaking tours, with in the various formats that I do, whether it's in podcast or actually going to the people.
Yeah.
I do a lot of presentations with the Florida Humanities Council, for example, really played a part in the development of this book. And then in 2019, I did a podcast with Dr. Ursula Odom. And I didn't even have the concept of the book yet. I didn't have anything really about the book, but it just was a thought. And I was like, yeah, I'm writing this book. I'm gonna make this book on Black nationalism. And this was 2019. And from that point forward, it had just been full go. So I did a conference in Atlanta in 2019 at the ASALA, African American for Association of Life and History. And I wrote a little white paper on it, or black paper, as I say,
Yeah.
and fielded a lot of questions from the audience, some that were very, very critical of what I was talking about.
Hmm.
And it was from an academic community. And so rather than beating myself about it and getting down about it, I just kind of dug in and just kept pushing forward. And then the first iteration of book was 2022. I submitted it for publication from various publishers. And one publisher said, okay, we'll take a look at it. We'll put it up for review to other people in the field. And again, it was like some of the critique wasn't even critique about the information or any technical thing. A lot of the critique was more so gatekeeping, because
Hmm.
they saw what I was doing, and it was almost like they wanted to jump on that idea. So they had to like create these little things in order for the publisher not to publish it. And so, so I'm in the middle of going back and forth with the publisher about certain things. And then I found Feral House,
Hmm.
did my research on Feral House, the books that they publish, and how they are very supportive or of what you may term as radical ideas. But I don't
Yeah.
call this idea radical. It's practical more than anything. It's not radical, it's practical. Um, so Fair House gave me a deal. And then this was last year in 2024. And then from there, it just full tilt. And so the writing process was very enjoyable with the editors over in Feral House. Learned a lot from them through the writing process. They also brought in a lot of not just academics, but actually people who were a part of the movement in the
Yeah.
60s and 70s to kind of look at it, give their thoughts on certain things. And then I was able to tighten it up even more so to the product that you see today. And those are things that more the academic presses wasn't going to do for me.
Hmm.
They wasn't going to, first of all, the cover art, beautiful cover art by Chuck D. They wasn't going to do that. Also, the contract that I had with one of the academic presses, I wasn't going to see any money until 10,000 copies were sold.
That's insane.
Exactly. And I didn't even and it was funny because I didn't even realize that until I ear hustled another academic, and they were talking about, contract and this and that. And I was like, I never read my contract. I was just happy to get a deal. I never read my contract with this press. So I wrote my contract. I'm like, what? I'm getting 0% percentage until 10,000 copies is sold. Oh, heck no. So that's when I went to start. That's when I contacted Feral House. Feral House gave me a very good deal, especially for as a first time author. and
Yeah.
being able to see money immediately, not waiting for 10,000 copies, which in the academia world, a lot of academics aren't seeing 10,000 copies sold, especially for a first book.
Yeah, no,
So,
what I was gonna say, it's like applying to a job at McDonald's and they say, well, won't give you a paycheck until, the amount of
it,
money that you have with us is like $1 million. Until you've earned $1 million working here, we won't send you a paycheck.
and that's how these academic presses survive. You literally, as an author, are doing free labor because writing a book is very laborious. It's
It is, yeah.
so you're doing free labor for no economic benefit in return. So now they say the thought process is that you get these deals and that'll help you become a tenure professor. And I didn't have the desire to do that. I didn't care about being a tenure professor. I want my book to go out to the grassroots. I don't care about my books, like I said, sitting on some shelf in a academic library, never seeing really the light of day. I wanted the academic masses to feel it. And so that's why Farrell House was perfect. The For that goal, the process of writing, the process of, the back the, it was several times it was very contentious as far as what I was saying and then what they understood, you know, but and I appreciated that because, you know, again, I'm writing towards a grassroots uh audience. And so if they don't understand, then of course the grassroots audiences are going to understand. So, so we got to a lot of conclusions and able to make sure what I was saying was still very clear in what I wanted to say, but for the grassroots to understand it. Because again, I'm coming from an still academic background in my writing. So I literally had to unlearn a lot of colonial style writing
Hmm.
in order to make sure that my audience that I'm aiming for with this book is plain as day is what I'm trying to say. So, and that is my most gracious thing about this product, about this vision that has come alive to this point today.
Yeah. Again, a lot of stuff in there, but some of them regarding like authorship. I myself I've spoken about this on previous podcasts. I've dealt with a similar experience. Unlike you, in the past, I've written fiction, not nonfiction. Feral House is very much like a nonfiction publisher, and I'm very glad they had me connected with you because it seems like a lot of their offers focus on these very controversial issues and topics, which is literally what our podcast is about. We tend to, look at these things in an objective way. We tend to talk about them in an academic way. It's been a fascinating journey. But a lot of the publishers, and this takes me back to a conversation that I had with a Swedish musician, and he told me that he abstained entirely. We had actually had him on the podcast, Hugo Daniel. He abstained entirely from all record labels because when he was very young and when he was up and coming in the world of music, what happened to him was that he pretty much from what I can remember correctly, he got signed to a record label, and essentially the deal that they had with him was something short of them stealing all of his work and taking all of the profit for it. They give you these long, long, contracts and things to sign, and as soon as you put your, ink to paper, they pretty much take the credit for all of your work. And it's very, very hard to negotiate yourself out of that contract. And that's something that is famous now in the publishing world. As books continue to, be shelved, as you said, in the back of a basement somewhere, in return for, Audible and ebooks and all of this, and YouTube video essays and all of these sort of like new methods of communication, a lot of the publishing companies tend to sustain themselves by pretty much ripping off their offers. They tend to take a large cut of the money in this contract. And this happened to me in the form of a vanity publisher, which was several years ago. And when I was trying to publish the novel which I had published, there was the vanity publisher that approached me and they said, "Hey, we love your work. We absolutely love it. We want to get it published as soon, ASAP." And to me, because I'm so young and because it was the concept of, being a published author for a signed publisher that was so appealing to me, it's something it's like a major life achievement. I was like, "Yeah, sure. Send me the contract ASAP." And they said, "Okay, sure, we'll send you the contract, but make sure that you pay us the $2,000 first." And I was just scratching my head. I was just like, "Wait a sec. You, you're, I, you." I'm gonna pay you to take the rights for my book.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense. And they're just like, wait, before you opt out of this, we're gonna throw in a free book publishing party for you. It's sort of like getting a demotion at work and then your boss being like, well, you'll get pizza next week. It's fine.
Right.
So no, in the publishing world, this does happen quite often. And I'm very glad that you kind of got connected with Pharaoh House because it not only meant that this episode of the podcast could happen, but that you could actually get a fair deal, for your book. And again, the cover art and everything involved is amazing. So, of course, summing up the episode, the link to your book and how to purchase it will be available in the description for all those who are interested. Very excited to see what you have going on in the future. And if there are any more things that you would like to say towards the end of this episode, feel free to say them.
No, I thank you so much for your time and and wanting to connect with me as far as this book and this project. I greatly appreciate it, and I just hope the audience got something out of it. And just the main thing here is that I'm all for unity, and so I believe this book is a vehicle for unity. So
Awesome. Well, Dr. Vincent Adejumo, thank you so much for coming on Scorpion Movement Podcast.
thank you.